Excellent. Thanks. That's great. Kristen Closer, I'm happy to just roll with this unless you want to say some words to kick us off today.
No, I think that's fine, David. Go for it.
Great. All right. So the agenda is posted in that link that I just put in the chat. And indeed, what we're going to do as a just transition reflection is to look at ideas around public engagement after December 1, and that is what that document is that's posted in the meeting materials. So we'll look at that, and Jane will walk us through that. Then what we want to spend the rest of the meeting on are going through the issues that we didn't get to yesterday, particularly in ag and ecosystems, because we didn't even get to the third bucket of issues around mitigation in particular. If there's other issues that people feel frustrated they didn't get to talk about yesterday, today's the opportunity to do that. And finally, we're going to ask you as a council if you're okay also picking up on at least one of the cross-sector issues that we didn't fully get to last week. And Liz Miller is here and open to having a conversation about the electricity sector pieces and the cross-sector work. And so if folks in the council here are okay doing that, we can address some of those issues today and take advantage of our time together. Great, I see a thumbs up from Bram. Great. So just before we get going, let's actually do a quick pause on this agenda and say, does that work for folks? Where we start out doing this just transitions reflection, looking at the public engagement plan post December 1, and then we spend the rest of our time lifting up some issues, particularly around ag and ecosystem that we didn't get to, although if folks have other things from rural resilience, that's okay too. And then assuming we have some time, Liz can help guide some conversation around questions that came up on the electric sector, cross-sector piece from last week. Okay. Any concerns about that? Jane, do you want to clarify? Sorry.
I do just want to pause and recognize that right now there are no co-chairs from Ag and Eco or Rural Resilience here. And so I do know that Billy Coster is not able to join today, and Abby and I were going back and forth last night. And okay, she is here. I didn't see her on the list yet. Thank you.
However, I guess what I would say is it's a little interesting to me that we're finishing up with Ag and Eco on a meeting when my co-chair isn't here, but we didn't finish up with, the procedure for this is very confusing and seems odd, but I will do my best to field questions.
Well, so what I was going to suggest, Abby, and want to see if this makes sense to you, Billy told me all along that he could not join this morning, so I knew that. And the recognition that we're going to finish with mitigation this morning, and Ryan Patch, who helped really take the lead on authoring that, is joining for that. And so we just might want to pause after that and see if we further revisit other issues or gaps with that work, or just move on from that for today.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. Right. So the third bucket around ag and ecosystem that we didn't even touch yesterday is around the mitigation for ag and ecosystem. And there, Ryan is here with us to help guide that. Yeah. Sue, I see your hands up. You're still on mute, Sue, if you're trying to talk. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
So I would like to ask, I think I explained that I barely can participate in this meeting. And Jane, I guess I had assumed that the piece from the Just Transitions Committee would be presented by me next week rather than by you today. Unless you're planning to present something else, I'd like to request that I have the opportunity to roll that out to the council next week in lieu of this week. Thanks.
It's something else, Sue. I did take your advice, and I pivoted quickly and moved you to next Tuesday, as we discussed, so both you and Sarah Phillips could join us for that. And this is really about our contract with Climate Access and RISE and our public engagement specifically after December 1st.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Any other questions or concerns about our work today and the agenda? Chris Cochran?
Is this a 1 hour meeting or a 2 hour meeting? I've got both.
It's blocked as 2. And if we run out of things to talk about before the end of that, we're happy to end early. Okay. Anything else on the agenda? Great. Okay. All right, let's do this then. Jane, do you want to walk us through what the public engagement consultant folks at Climate Access and Rise, what you're talking about with them for their work post December 1st on public engagement?
Sure, thank you. So recognizing that we have our Just Transitions reflection moment at the beginning, and public engagement is a core component of how we envision building equitable solutions into the future, I wanted to revisit public engagement for what it will look like after December 1st as we roll out the Climate Action Plan, this initial plan, recognizing that we had hoped to really get into that conversation with Climate Access and Rise when they joined us a few weeks ago now to present the public engagement findings from this fall, but really we're more focused on the actual engagement that we did than really thinking about how we use that as a catalyst to think about what we do this winter. And since then, we have our regular check-ins, A&R staff with Climate Access and Rise, and have been working with them to refine an approach for December 1st through March of this year, which you'll all, I hope, remember that we have them through the public engagement plan that they developed for us earlier this year. We have them on contract through the end of March and have been thinking about this as a multi-phase rollout of engagement and understanding what we will and won't get to in this first CAP. We've been trying to really target and focus what the rollout of engagement will be with their support. This is not intended to be inclusive of all engagement. Already through my posting of this document online last night, Catherine, who wasn't able to join us this morning, elevated the recognition and appreciation that this does not feel like enough, and that we all want to do more and really want to be thinking about how to use resources like Marion and I and the agency, and how we'll focus and consider rolling out the initial climate action plan. But this is what we really want to focus and use our consultants for to direct. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen quickly and walk through some of the key components of the proposal as we see it, and then open it up for you all to comment to help us inform this, recognizing that much of this will start on December 1st. If we are successful in adopting a plan that day, which I hope and trust we will be, the rollout of that will start right on that day. And so we want to start to be planning and lifting up this work with them as much as possible to anticipate that. So briefly, this is based on the scope of work that was already defined and written into their contract, but we've been narrowing it as well as honing it in on what we know we'll be able to achieve and what we want to do that feels authentic, recognizing that much of the actions are associated with the climate action plan will also have multiple swim lanes and pathways to embark on after December 1st, trying to work with the public and explain the different roadmap for the different components of the climate action plan. So first and foremost, Climate Access and Rise are already working on generating a short summary of the Vermont Climate Action Plan. That we're talking about a 2-page overview summary that they can start to work on and draft now, knowing that the high level it's going to be at. That will be part of and parcel with the press release that they plan to roll out and launch on December 1st to get ahead of a media strategy. That will be larger component of a media outreach strategy that gets us to think about also the application of social media between December 1st and March of this year, and how we'll be rolling that out with communication around the plan itself. Some of the components that we really fell short on this fall due to timing was elevating and working coherently with partner organizations. We actually have money in our budget with Climate Access and RISE for them to pay and support partner organizations who want to help roll out the climate action plan with us. So rather than just having the state, I shouldn't say state, I should say council-led events that we had this fall, we want to also have events that are held and supported by partner organizations where there's already meetings happening, already events that we can sort of tap into and leverage to roll out the messaging of the climate action plan with those targeted audiences. Those organizations that we'll plan to work with collaboratively have been identified already through partners who engaged with us early in the roundtables, have engaged with us through the interview process, and have said that they want to help us with this. We know that there's probably others that we've missed through that, so we also intend to engage, have an additional query to the council to hear your recommendations about who some of those organizations are that we should be partnering with to roll this out. And we really want to have a targeted relationship and component with the Just Transition Subcommittee, understanding that they'll really help us have a role in getting into frontline and impacted communities and using and activating their networks to help us do so. So we're hoping to be able to do what we had hoped to do this fall, have targeted materials and support of facilitation so that members of the Just Transitions Committee and their connections can help use those materials to roll this plan out. We also have a more targeted approach for online meetings this time. Last time we did 3 online meetings as well as 4 in-person events. We only plan to have 3 online meetings this time, and we really want to use this as a way to communicate what we've been focused on as a multi-pronged approach after when we share the plan. So we want to educate folks about what is in the plan in a communicable and digestible way, but then we want to be clear about articulating how Vermonters can get engaged. So speaking to the legislative process that's happening over there and how they can activate their legislators to help advance actions that they see as priorities. Speaking to the personal action pathway, which really talks about how Vermonters themselves can actually help uplift climate action. And then also communicating the components of the work that is still going to be ongoing with the council, because there's sort of these different swim lanes, as I was mentioning earlier, around how the actions can move forward after December 1st. And there will be a heavy component of further work that the council will need to do. And this is what we can be speaking about with Vermonters, recognizing that this is an iterative plan and that folks can engage and help us think about ways to further the climate action plan process. And we can be gathering feedback for future iterations of the CAP, but not likely articulating a clear, decisive timeline of when we expect to revise the CAP. And that's something I do want to put a pin in for you all to be thinking about, because that's something that the council hasn't really discussed in detail yet. We also have the opportunity through the contract with the Climate Access and RISE to use an engagement platform that they've had success partnering with in the past. It's typically called a deliberative polling platform. And if this was a time when we were rolling out the climate action plan as draft, we could have used this to really lift up and understand how Vermonters want us to prioritize actions and sort of rank, and in real time, they could be seeing what other Vermonters want with respect to climate action plan. But the tool is really versatile. And what I've understood from them is that we can set it up as a way for Vermonters to actively engage in the climate action plan and have the summary and educational component, as well as understanding of like how different levers and how different policies get us to the end game of the climate transformation that we want to see in Vermont. As we move through all of this in the winter, we expect that there'll be a rollout of another plan in March. And what that looks like now, I really am focused on that component of conversation with all of you, but we've really been sort of rolling back the idea in a way that we'll have real substantive revisions to the plan in March, just understanding the challenges of setting another tight timeline to meet, that I think we want to be fluid around how we make revisions to the climate action plan. And that's, again, though, a conversation for you all to direct us in thinking about. But regardless of how substantive the iterations are in March, we expect over the winter to have a more marketable plan, because really on December 1st, we're going to be like stapling together the Word documents that we're all working on right now. And we intend to engage with the CMO for the state, the Chief Marketing Officer, to make the plan visually appealing, to think about how we work with all of you to get case studies and real life Vermont examples into the plan, as well as proofing and editing and all of those kinds of really robust and important things that we're not going to get to for December 1st. So along with that, we'll be summarizing the public input and evaluating the impact of that outreach, and be able to roll that all out with another press release and some targeted outreach and engagement around social media and beyond in March of this year. So that's what we have with Climate Access and RISE. And I know the conversation with all of you will likely have this evolve, and I'm interested in hearing input, and specifically interested, if not today, to have a further conversation with all of you about what the timeline of this winter looks like for updates to the climate action plan, and what a realistic timeline looks like for really substantive iterations to the climate action plan, knowing that we're required to do it in 4 years, but likely we'll do it much sooner this time, knowing that we're not going to have everything all done for this first iteration. I'll pause there, stop sharing, and let the conversation happen.
Great. So we have some time to reflect on this. We don't need to make a decision on this today. This is just Jane laying out how that conversation is going on between ANR and the consultant, working on your behalf as counsel. So any reactions would be welcome, and we can pick this back up in subsequent meetings. Bram, go ahead.
So I have a couple of quick thoughts. One is, when we talk about substantial revisions to the plan, and what the timeline is for submitting the first revised plan, I just think that the next plan will not be ready for submission until we have achieved the public engagement and outreach to every corner of the state that we had hoped to do prior to December 1st. So, whatever the technical changes are, I think we shouldn't hand anything in until we've kind of fulfilled our public engagement goals. And the other thing I just want to have us keep in mind is that there are a lot of people who would be interested if they knew what we were up to, and would have an opinion, and would provide valuable points of view and life experience. So there's sort of a top level campaign to engage with those people, make them aware of what's going on and how to engage, and so forth. There's another pool of people who sort of at the surface don't want to be involved in this, and there are all sorts of complicated socio and psychological reasons that we cannot possibly address as to why people don't want to engage in this process or in various other public processes. But I think we need to think about the interests of those people who feel like they don't understand it, feel like they don't have anything to contribute, feel like they've got whatever they do won't make any difference, who don't understand the legislative, like all those reasons why people may just not be interested in participating. Like we can't change all those things, but I think it is an obligation that we have to keep their interests and their points of view in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Bram. Chris Cochran.
Nice to see this. I do think public engagement is really important. I think it's an important gap that we fill. Just a practical consideration. I mean, I'd really like to participate in this. I was unable to participate in the early engagement, but it's going to be during the legislative session when you're doing this. And it's just, I know for me, it's going to be very hard. And I suspect others who work for the administration may face similar challenges. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Rich?
Yeah, a couple of things. I really agree with the comments that Bram made about the importance of outreach and how it's going to take some time. A comment about deliberative polling. My experience with deliberative polling is that there are ways to do it that make it really valuable if it's really deliberative. That is, if the participants in the polling process are given a substantial opportunity to learn more and to engage in some dialogue. So it's a learning process for individuals who may not, at the very beginning of a process, know that much about how these policy levers work. So it's important to do that right. That's the second thing. Third thing is that wouldn't we want to wait until the legislature has had the opportunity to hold hearings, bear down on this, reflect upon it, give us some feedback about the large number of policy proposals we're going to be putting on their plate before we try to roll out a revised plan. And then finally, the word marketable is mildly problematic. I mean, what we're trying to engage people, and I understand that we have an obligation to prepare documents and what have you, and an outreach strategy that is understandable to people. But I'm not sure that marketable is really the right word to describe the burden we bear to make our proposals understandable and transparent to Vermonters generally.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. Great. Chris Campany?
Yeah, I just, something what I think we need to discuss is because of the pandemic and other reasons, we've not been able to kind of literally meet people where they are. And I think we need to think through, I mean, it's great to reach out to other partner organizations to help with the outreach, but I think we need to have like council representatives there. They may not always be local council reps because the way we're geographically distributed. It'd be great to have subcommittee members there to the extent they can, but I just think we need to talk. I mean, I don't think we can just do all this by Zoom and remote. And I think we need to actually have a human face on this thing. Acknowledging that everything that we're proposing affects us as, council members too. And that we really want to listen and hear what folk have to say about, the current draft and the future iteration. So just something for us to ponder. I know not everybody has the time to do that. It may, frankly, some of these meetings could be really hard depending on how this thing is received when it rolls out. But I think that like literally being there in person, meeting with people when we can is going to be really important.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, great. Those are some really helpful reflections. As always, I'm trying to take notes. I can share my screen, my notes, but I'm not sure it's going to add a lot of value. I think we need to circle back with the council on this. And there's clearly some decision points that the council can make to inform the way Jane and company are working with the consultants on this. June, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Just wanted to echo what Chris said. And as you know, I've been a proponent of doing our business here as a council on Zoom. But when it comes to reaching the public and getting their feedback, I think it's absolutely critical that we have a means of dealing with the public in person as well. That certainly tracks with my experience in doing public hearings at the department and at the PUC, and especially with the Act 174 work we did around community standards for planning on enhanced energy plans. So Chris, you're spot on, and I'm taking the council's time to articulate my support in this fashion because I want to make sure the minutes reflect that it wasn't just one counselor who had that view.
Great. And I see some head noddings as well. So I think there's a number of you who are in some thumbs up. So absolutely. Okay, great. Okay. So the next steps on that is, I think we need to, Jane will tee up a section of upcoming meetings so that there's some actual decision points for you as a council in helping to guide this going forward. And Jane, just help me out if you already have a plan for that, or we'll make it in the coming weeks.
Sorry, what was the specific ask? I was reading the comments and wanted to respond to Kelly in particular and just say that we're happy to share the summary docket, the CAP, before it roll out, as well as the press release.
Right, absolutely, yep. No, my question is, it feels like there are some decision points here about this that we need to bring to the full council and schedule it up with an agenda item to say we're going to make some decisions around this. So that needs to happen in the coming weeks as well. And we can do that and make sure it's on an agenda and everybody can know what's coming.
Yeah, definitely. And just quickly about in-person events, we talked a bunch with Climate Access and Rise about those. We found them really productive this fall, but we were also able to hold them safely outside, which also caused some challenges. And heading into the winter with the numbers the way they are with COVID right now, it seemed like a large obstacle to overcome right now, but we certainly appreciate the benefit of in-person events, and we'll be continually monitoring how to do that safely.
Great. June?
Well, to that point, Jane, thank you for raising that. Again, this is a fact, the pandemic, the rising numbers that ought to be brought to the attention of the legislature. To date, their timeline for this report and our process around it has not been disturbed by the reality that the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed long before we were in the pandemic, or at least that's my memory of it. So there should be room here somewhere to be able to create a window of opportunity for us to do this public engagement fully, which involves those in-person meetings, in my view. And I quite agree with you, Jane. The numbers right now, the circumstances right now do not militate in favor of that. So I'm at a loss at this point to suggest how we cross that, but somewhere we need a partner from the legislative end. Thanks.
Thanks, June. Okay. All right. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Jane, for doing that work with Climate Access and Rise and getting that organized. Let's pivot into our conversations of what we didn't get to yesterday afternoon. Particularly, there was a final bucket of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee recommendations around mitigation that we didn't even touch yesterday. And it seemed like an opportunity for us to see if there were concerns. Ryan Patch is here, who's been sort of the leading force in the subcommittee to help shepherd those ideas forward. We have from our summary of key issues a few things that came up, but frankly, it was awfully few. And so I can paste those into the chat if you just give me 1 second to go find that document, because I have too many documents open right now. There we go. Okay. So there was a number of issues that came up. And actually, I can just share my screen. These were the 3 things that came through the survey. And those of you who are here today may have other things as you read it that you didn't get a chance to put into the survey. But these were 3 issues. I just highlighted one of them of seeming like there was some clarity questions there that really would benefit from better understanding of what's being proposed. So the first point was wanting some clarity about the recommendations about agroforestry and silvopasture about incorporating woody vegetation, is that only about existing agricultural lands, or are we actually somehow opening up the possibility of new lands, which raises questions about additional loss of forest? So there's some questions there that were raised. These two other points were about one about equity and access to existing programs, and that many times in the document, as requested, we point to existing programs. However, wondering if there really it's fully equitable and accessible to all farmers. And then a request about coordination with other states, particularly around federal policy and how to maximize what Vermont can get there. And so strengthen alliances with Eastern Mountain states on the federal programs. Okay, so that's what came in through the survey. And I don't know, Ryan, if you want to immediately just provide some additional clarity on some of those issues. And then those of you who have concerns, we can raise those up. But Ryan, maybe I'll turn it over to you. And I'm happy to drop my screen or keep it up depending on what seems helpful.
Sure, happy to dive right in and try to provide some clarifying information and answer further questions. Digging in first to the question of agroforestry and silvopastoral systems. To set the framework, according to the 2017 USDA Ag Census, farmers in Vermont manage over 527,000 acres of woodland at that time. Of that, 24,000 acres of the woodland is currently pastured by farms. Whether or not that management meets the practice standards of silvopasture or agroforestry, we don't know. So what we're talking about is perhaps a bit distinct from that current use of woodland from farms, excluding maple sap collection for maple syrup production. The definition that we used in the subtask group and shared with the subcommittee includes, the NRCS conservation practice standard, which means the establishing a combination of trees and compatible forages on the same acreage. The national USDA standard says that silvopasture systems are specifically designed and managed to produce trees, forage, and livestock on the same acreage. And a silvopastoral system can be created when forage crops are introduced or enhanced in a forested system, when trees are added to a forage system, or when both trees and forages are established on suitable land. And so you tend to see, plantations and alley cropping be where forage is introduced and animals and livestock are introduced into that system. We don't have those systems of silviculture in Vermont, really. And, in conversations and coordination with NRCS Vermont, the focus of the silvopasture practice is going to be on the integration of woody tree species within pasture areas. And so while the recommendation here is absent on the directionality of which way is it trees and pasture? Is it improving forage in forested areas? It's silent on that, but the federal practice implementation is going to be focused on the establishment of woody vegetation in pastures. And so silvopasture is just one part of agroforestry. The agroforestry practices that are eligible in Vermont include windbreaks, riparian forest buffers, silvopasture, which includes a number of supporting pasture management practices. Those are really the big three of the five that NRCS can pay on.
Great, that's really helpful. Yeah,
it's a massively important climate adaptation strategy for farmers, as well as temperatures increase and drought increases. The addition of trees to pasture systems particularly provides increased resilience to both the land base and the livestock, increasing animal care, et cetera. So it's really important for a number of reasons.
Great, thanks, Abby.
And and yes, it's just to be very clear, it is not the, cutting of forest to make silvopasture systems or to promote agroforestry. It is the holistic approach to ecosystem function with where livestock and forest and pasture ecosystems are balanced.
Great. Any concerns about that, or is that sufficient clarity for anybody who had some questions about that? I'm not even sure the person who made that comment is on the phone, but and any other clarity needed on that point in that set of recommendations? Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan and Abby. That's really helpful. So the other pieces around equity and how the document points in multiple places to, or several places to existing programs. And I wonder if there was any reaction when you saw that comment, either Ryan or Abby, and what, if anything, might be adapted to the document based on that?
I'm sorry, which one?
Sure.
Oh, the equity one.
The
I'll let
equity
Ryan.
piece.
Okay. I'll kick it off, Abby, and please, of course, share any follow-up. I think, equity screening and lens is something that needs to be more fully integrated in this process. The framing that's provided in this specific ag mitigation section focuses on, very heavily existing state programs where the minimum eligibility requirements are that you are a farm that is regulated in farming in Vermont. And so trying to speak to who's eligible to apply, those that are farming. When, some of the questions that the asker asked, is probably the best way to phrase that, but, questions about scale of farm, size of farm, and access. And that's absolutely something that the programs work on and collaborate with other state and federal partners. In statute, the Agency of Ag is directed to collaborate with NRCS on projects and funding, and NRCS has many more resources for environmental conservation management than the state. And so trying to direct farms to go there first and utilize those state funds first for the most practices that can get on the ground. And, state programs are there to either fill in the gaps with the programs or provide, other practices that may not be funded in a way that works for Vermont. But to that point, there are folks that don't want to participate in federal programs or, find, some of the administrative processes, burdensome, and so they choose to come to state programs. And so we work to, try to make it accessible and distribute, the funds across as many farms as possible, frankly. And so when it comes to small farms, as an example, in last fiscal year, for cover crop payments, we had a 3.2 acre payment and a 4.3 acre payment of $96 and $129, respectively. And so, some very small producers are able to access state programming. That's not to say that it can't be improved. But for the purposes of the equity screening, we didn't have time to really dig into that. And so didn't want to say things were good or bad, but happy to add additional details that folks would like to see in that space, but just tried to leave it generic that, if you are a jurisdictional farm, you can apply to these programs.
Thanks, Ryan.
This is another one of those areas where time is a factor. We didn't want to pretend that we had the ability to do the full equity screening on all of, 150 of our actions or whatever it was, or even fully on all of our strategies. And so we didn't. I hope and will push to be an ongoing conversation within the Agency of Agriculture. And I think, the additionality of an equity lens is something that all state agencies need to start thinking about in a different context based on the guiding principles. That would be my thinking, is as a positive of this work that's been being done. And I assume that, I do know that the agency is currently looking for a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And so I think that that's a part of the work to come within thinking about the equitable distribution of resources to not, and I think there's, just to be completely transparent, I think too, there's work to be done in terms of, you know, who doesn't qualify as a farmer and or where are there issues, other issues at play for land access or BIPOC communities, et cetera. And those things are going to need to be looked at too, but I do believe that that work will continue.
Thanks, Abby. Any other concerns from counselors or follow up to this issue, Secretary Moore?
I just that had been my comment, and I think Abby, your remarks really speak to it. It feels we may need a little bit more nuance in the way it's presented in the document to the extent that goes out to the public. It comes across as like our work here is done. And we've already considered it, and very much appreciate that there isn't enough time to go through that full equity screen effort for each of these actions on the timeline we've been provided. And so just encourage maybe taking another look at the words on the page and see if there's a way to have them be a little bit more reflective of that.
Yeah, that's also in my intention block over the next few weeks, is to go back through that specifically. But don't worry, Anson, you can't see Anson's face, but he and Ryan know they're not rid of me yet. So I'll keep pushing them.
Thanks, Abby. Chris Campany?
One of the challenges historically too has been, especially the federal programs, the types of income information that's requested. Some farmers just frankly don't have that or can't provide it. And I don't know to what extent Vermont has dealt with this on like Clean Water Initiative and other programs, but that may be another specific piece that we should look at as far as, because some of that information that's requested, you know, it's kind of geared towards more traditional operations or more traditional reporting, and it may exclude farmers who otherwise, you know, have good reason to be included in these programs. So just wanted to flag that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. Anything else on this issue? Great. Okay. And then the third issue that came through the survey was, and I think Chris Campany, this was your issue, not to put you in the hot seat, but about strengthening alliances with other Eastern Mountain states, particularly around making federal ag policy work for Vermont. Do you want to just say another word about that?
Yeah, just for context for the council, in a former life, I was the federal policy coordinator for the national campaign for sustainable agriculture on the 2002 Farm Bill. That's now the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. But historically, I've not played in the Farm Bill realm for a couple of farm bills, but historically, the Northeast does not fare particularly well in competition against Midwest, West, and Southern agricultural interests. And also, sometimes it's hard to really compete against the interests of the processors and what are called integrators. Those are the entities that own everything from the genetics all the way to the shelf space at the stores. And so in my experience in the past, at least, oftentimes the sustainable ag realm, and I would include like sustainable ag and regenerative ag realm, the kinds of practices that we're talking about here as a council tend to be represented more by NGOs and not states. I would just encourage, and maybe that's changed, but see if we can, as a state of Vermont, engage more with the NGOs and hopefully government, you know, departments of ag in other states to try to make the next iterations of the Farm Bill really take into account the needs in Vermont. And I would say probably the practical alliance is just the mountain states of the East generally, to really try to get a stronger foothold in the upcoming farm bills. And I'm happy to make some, I've been out of it, but there are a lot of the same players still in there. I'm happy to talk about this some if anybody's interested.
Thanks, Chris. Ryan, Abby, are there things that could be added right away to this? Does this go in the sort of bucket of, yep, we need to deal with that, but probably after December 1? Like, how do we, what, if anything, could change in the very short term in the documents on this?
The Secretary Tebbets and the Agency of Agriculture participate in both the National Associations of State Departments of Agriculture and the Northeast Association of the State Departments of Agriculture. And so that is an organizing two groups that work to coordinate response and comments on federal policy, both Farm Bill and Farm Bill related programs. And so that's the mechanism through which the Agency of Ag generally works to understand how other states are feeling about a particular national policy and provide feedback and comment on it as an example. So I think when talking about agriculture and both supporting programs, whether conservation or food-based, absolutely have to bring in federal policy. Where a state climate action plan can highlight that we need to continue to do this and opportunities to strengthen that comment, I definitely think we could work to include that recommendation. I think it may fit better in one of the other ag and eco sections than the specific mitigation bucket here. But I believe this comment was also raised in the sequestration section. And so calling out a specific strategy and action on that makes sense to me.
Okay. Great. Anything else on that topic? All right. Before we, so that was what came in the survey, those three issues in the bucket of mitigation steps for ag and ecosystem. Was there anything else that folks wanted to flag up and take advantage of Ryan's presence and Abby's presence here to have a quick conversation about in that mitigation bucket? Jared?
Thanks, David. So I just want to raise, this is not to the level of a concern that it needs to be addressed before this moves forward, but I just want to raise something that I think is kind of under the surface or behind the scenes a little bit on this, just to make sure that we have some transparency around it and some kind of common understanding. As I read these recommendations around mitigation pathways for agriculture, there is a real mix of things that would count in and show up in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory in terms of gross emissions. So for instance, reductions around related to strategies around feed or around manure management. There are a set of other strategies that talk about sequestration and storage in soils and other land use practices that look to increase carbon sinks that would not show up in our gross emissions inventory, but that would show up in the carbon budget. And so some of these mitigation strategies are relevant towards the post-2050 net zero target. Some of them are really relevant towards the 2025 and 2030 gross emissions reduction, but there is a mix of those in there. I think it is really important that we have investments in improved agricultural practices in forests and forest connectivity and sequestration and storage, and am very supportive of payments for ecosystem services. I do think, however, that it is very important that we have a high degree of integrity and of rigor in terms of our data tracking and reporting, and that it is just a fact that we have significant data limitations and data quality concerns, as was mentioned in the carbon budget, with regard to historical information, baseline information, and other information going forward that will allow us to confidently understand some of those net emissions questions with regard to land use. My two biggest concerns specifically are around additionality and permanence. We need to make sure that if we're going to count something, whether it's in a carbon budget or elsewhere, that it is an addition beyond a baseline, and we're not counting something that was going to happen otherwise. I think we also need to make sure that we don't count things on a going forward basis that may change. We have seen many states and countries count an emissions reduction related to forests or forest offsets that later, because ironically, tragically, because of the climate crisis, led to forest fires, and then it became a net source of emissions rather than a net sink when those fires happened. We have seen the same thing with agricultural land that was supposed to be a sink, but when drought conditions happened, it had created a flux of emissions. So I just want to recognize that the land use sector is very different than the energy sectors in terms of the ways that we account for those emissions and the degree and the things that we need to do to have clarity and confidence in the quality of the data going forward. I think it's also really important that we're clear that the Global Warming Solutions Act refers to gross emissions reduction requirements, and that the net language does not come in until after 2050. So I think all of the things that are in these pathways and strategies are very important, but some will count in some place, some will count in another place, and there's more work that needs to be done to figure out how we sustainably do this in terms of payments for ecosystem services, other things, and in terms of how we improve the data quality and confidence across the board going forward.
Thanks, Jared. And to be extra clear, we've spoken about this several times. The RFP that's going out is largely focused exactly on that, how to answer these questions about additionality, permanence, and accounting between gross and net, right? So we have a pathway of research of addressing these issues. Okay. All right. Thanks.
David, just to follow up on that. Yeah, I saw you. Was there a nodding of a head on that? Do we have specifics on exactly on the? I guess I don't remember seeing the RFP. I may have just missed it, but I mean, is land use specifically in there? Have we called out exactly what we're looking at in terms of land use and what we're trying to measure?
So Jane is in the best position to know the status of where that is. It is a recommendation that was agreed to by you all's council and is part of the recommendations of this subcommittee and will be part of the recommendations of December 1. But Jane, you can say a little bit more about the timing and any advances in terms of putting the exact scope on that RFP.
Yeah, when we talked about this, we all agreed that an RFI was not necessary because we had enough information that in this space that we could advance an RFP. That RFP will need to be considered amongst all of the other budgetary asks on the Global Warming Solutions Act after we adopt a climate action plan and understand the fully prioritized needs and recommendations for further technical analysis. So it's a priority action that will be vetted with all the others as we move forward.
Great. Okay.
Just a quick follow-up. So we'll be discussing the budget going forward for the council, right, Jane? That's going to be on a future agenda.
I saw that there was an email recommended this morning to me that the GWSA budget and understanding what it is and what we have left currently be on a future agenda, and I'm more than happy to do that. And then the council can make recommendations for the remaining funds on how they'd like to see it considered for A&R, but it's an A&R budget to consider with all of you.
And I appreciate the agencies responsible for managing it. I just think the council needs input, be able to provide input in how that budget is being used. That's pretty typical it just seems like a reasonable request.
Of course, and that's how it was handled this year with all of you for the existing contracts that we have. So.
Okay, all right. Great. Anything else on this? All right. So we're at a pivot moment here where we could, if folks have other things for Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee that we didn't manage to lift up yesterday or in a further review of this, we could do that. Abby's still here. We don't have Billy to help out. But I'll just say, if there's things that are burning in people's minds, let's name it now and let's see if we can address it. So let me pause. Anything else on ag and ecosystems that we just haven't wrestled with and from yesterday afternoon or just now this morning? Okay. Great. Okay, so I think this is an opportunity, if particularly if Liz, if you're up for it, to go to some of the issues of cross-sector that we didn't get to last week. We unfortunately don't have the right folks on the phone to do some of the transportation conversations, so we didn't tee that up correctly. However, Liz did offer to deal with, take some comments around and talk through some of the issues on the electricity sector. I see Jane's hands up, so maybe this is moving in real time.
No, I wanted to appreciate what you were saying, David, and recognizing the limited time we had, we decided to put transportation on the agenda for next Tuesday so that folks had the capacity to know that we were diving back into that conversation, knowing it would be a substantive one. I did just and appreciate Liz and Ed McNamara is also on the call, who's the other task lead for electricity, or at least I saw him at one point. And so wanted to give the opportunity to the council to start to re-engage in cross-sector issues, mindful that we only got through a component of one of the 4 sectors last week related to buildings and thermal. So our intent is to come back to all of the issues, gaps, and concerns that were lifted up through the survey. And we'll do that through 2 meetings next week, both Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. And we'll be focused on letting you all know on the agenda when we'll plan to discuss what. I did just drop in the chat and wanted to put your attention to it, that on the resource page on the website for the Climate Council, Cross-Sector did an excellent job going through the table that Marion and I put in the Climate Action Plan guidance for how to respond to concerns and comments and questions. All of the concerns that were lifted up through the survey are in the table, and there are direct responses to every concern in writing, and it's now on the resource page. And along with that table, there are also components of how they were then addressed in further refinements of the drafts, or where they declined not to make those revisions and a supporting justification for why. So that table will be an excellent resource for folks to review and look at for next week's meeting, also to ensure that you're seeing reconciliation with your own issues and gaps that you elevated. Also, there are updated and revised drafts for 3 of the sectors now on that page, non-energy, transportation, and buildings and thermal. And those copies, I just want to say, are clean copies. They don't show track changes. And rather than having a track change copy and a clean copy, that all of the comments and changes that were made in those drafts are on this table. So you can go through this table and really see what you are hoping to find in updated drafts associated with it. Knowing that there were still some questions and concerns around electricity, the updated draft is not on yet, but will be in the next day or so. And hopefully David can remind us, if you all want to take this on right now, remind us of what those issues and gaps and concerns were through the survey, and we can have a dialogue over the course of the next hour or half hour or whatever it takes. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Jane. And for folks who haven't used the resources page, and please reach out to Jane if it's not intuitive enough, so you can find these documents that Jane says are there. Jane or Marion will be happy to walk you through how to quickly use that resources page to pull up the documents you need. So if we want to dive into the, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to say one more thing about the resource page, since you put a finer point on it, which is just to remind folks that every week when we're putting new documents out to the council gets the docs as part of their agenda and on the web page for that council meeting. The following week, for the next council meeting, that same time that we post new documents for that council meeting, all of the revised documents that you have discussed are on that resource page now. So there are updated versions of every document that has come in front of the council to date. And except for cross-sector, who used the table format, you'll see track change versions as well as clean copies with the updated dates associated with them. So in your free time, when you're not reviewing all the new documents for this meeting or next meeting, there are updated documents that are building the comprehensive draft that will come on the 23rd of November.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Okay, and do reach out to Marion or Jane if for some reason that resources page is not working for you in pulling up this information. Okay, so the survey that we did on cross-sector lifted up 3 points, at least that's how I pulled it together, 3 points on the electricity sector aspect of this. And I just dropped them in the chat. These are the 3 things that came up, at least that I summarized. One was specifically about the PUC and equity, and questions about how the PUC is able to address equity issues, and then what that means in terms of how we refer to it in our documents. The second is about Hydro-Quebec specifically, and then concerns more broadly about impacts outside of Vermont and how we're thinking about our electricity sector. And third was one around chemical usage with the increase in electrification was a comment that came in. So those are 3 things that came in. I know, Liz, you've probably seen that summary previously. If you haven't, I apologize, but I think it may even be in that table that Jane referenced. But Jane, Liz, if you want to say a few words about these concerns and some of the conversations at cross-sector about addressing them to date.
Sure, and Ed is also on, so we can both weigh in. First, just process-wise, we also received some what I would call text cleanup comments from Secretary Moore and Jared, and maybe, I can't remember if we got a couple others, but we've also consolidated those. And Jane, I can work with you on whether we should go to the work of putting those edits in the table. Those are all like, don't use we, instead, change the way the sentence is written type comments that I don't think really rise to the level of discussing them here. And to the extent either Secretary Moore or others raised bigger concerns, hopefully they're captured through these comment tables, and we can make sure that happens when we post the next draft. But it would be great to not do that for the small edits, because I think it'll create a lot of work for us to put those in the table. So I don't know if that's going to mean a red line version of ours or not, but we can talk about it. In terms of the table that Jane posted the link on and is on the resource page, the concerns, David, that you addressed are on there. So maybe we can just decide which of those we want to have a conversation about based upon whether our response that we've put in is adequate for this purpose. And we're not in quite the same order as yours because we also received a substantive comment regarding the cross-cutting issue of on-bill financing. I think we addressed a lot of that in last week's council session. So we've added a written response as it applies to what we know about the electricity sector and the electric utilities participation in the upcoming pilot. So unless anyone raises a hand or wants to discuss that one further, I would suggest we move on to the others.
That's great. And I think we did have quite a bit of discussion about on-bill financing.
Yep.
So I think it's worth reading the response. And then after you've had a chance to read the response, then maybe we can circle back even at the end of this meeting if there's something more. But yeah, let's push on to some of the other pieces that we haven't talked about.
Great. Okay. The next substantive comment in the table is the one that you mentioned, David, on reliance on the PUC, and specifically the comment was around the PUC's ability to take into account DEI and environmental justice principles. I think if I remember correctly, there were questions about both their level of training and then in the rollout, how that would work. And the suggestion that we've put in the written table is that those issues regarding both DEI training as well as application of environmental justice principles and then specifically the just transition principles that we've adopted be lifted up into a cross-cutting issue. It applies not just to the PUC, but to other state permitting processes that we've discussed here, and indeed other state program processes, including applying for programs and that sort of thing. So making sure that it gets lifted up into a cross-cutting section makes a lot of sense. And with respect to the PUC specifically, in the draft that will be posted next, we will ensure the word equity does show up already in the draft that you've seen, but with regard to the PUC putting these programs in place equitably, but we will add a little bit more text around that to ensure that the text itself reflects that the PUC regulated process needs to take those principles into consideration in through both rulemaking and then any application of statutory principles.
That's great.
I'll stop there and ask if there are questions or other comments from Ed or others.
Does that seem like a sensible path forward for us as a council? What's in the side of the table there? June?
Well, any mention of the PUC is going to get my attention. But I to cut to the chase, Liz, are we essentially saying that in this cross-cutting piece, which I agree would apply with equal force and Act 250 and the like, is the idea that we would be making a recommendation as the council to have this put in statute expressly, that equity considerations have to be layered into these review processes? It's a very specific question, but my point is that right now we are reliant on interpretation of existing statutes to achieve this end, and I have complete faith in individuals to have an equitable sensibility. I recall not long ago the chair of the PUC issuing a public challenge to me in some forum or another, might have been in an ISO board meeting or something, about, if you put it in front of us, we'll do it. And I appreciated the spirit, but these are the kinds of things that ought to be in statutory mandates so that you're not so dependent on the person, but rather you institutionalize it. Can you speak to that, or am I getting ahead of myself?
I can speak to it only to say that in the electricity sector mitigation work, we did not lift that up as a recommendation because our charge was to look at ways the electricity sector could mitigate carbon. So our recommendation here is that the issue, including whether it be statutorily enshrined, be taken up as a cross-cutting. And I do think that we've seen in other recommendations, for example, regarding the bill sponsored by Senator Rahm and others on environmental justice, that the council take a position that those be adopted, and that would be a perfect place to make that decision. So from a personal point of view, supporting that, I think that would be something we should take up. And in the electricity sector mitigation report, we are not stating, adopt a statute for this specific purpose, but instead suggesting that it get lifted up across state action, state government. And I think that's consistent with how Governor Scott has treated it with regard to agency action too. So it would be probably appropriate to do it for that reason as well.
No, that makes sense. It's helpful to have to unpack this a little and to marry up the specific sector reports with the overarching considerations in the larger report that we're thinking about. So I follow the thread, and I thank you for that.
Great. Okay, so that does, raises the issue for us when we deal with cross-cutting to come back to this, right? So that's what I'm hearing here is let's come back to it when we look at those cross-cutting pieces and look at it there, and as a council try to understand what we're doing. And those of you who are working in that cross-cutting space, I hope that you're hearing this conversation and can pull this in to that into your work if you're not already doing it. Okay, great. Anything else on this issue? Great. So why don't we move forward? I'm sharing my screen. Please tell me to stop if it's distracting. So, but if you want to just keep rolling forward. Liz?
Sure, I can keep, I guess, emceeing as it were. The next comment I believe Rich made, and would be interested in any further discussion on how to address it in text. We are updating the text just to note the passage of the federal infrastructure bill. There's still other bills pending that would increase the possibility of federal funding specifically for this purpose. This is the electrification of all, and to be specific, the pieces of that would flow to businesses and homeowners and renters rather than utility infrastructure specifically. At least that's how I took the comment. And I know that the Clean Heat Standard recommendations and Tier 3 provide some potential support for this as well, depending upon how they are rolled out or modified to work together. So just in our text, we had not proposed and don't expect in a revision to propose any specific funding mechanism, but instead making sure to note that federal sources should be used wherever possible. State programs, when rolled out, require the design of funding to be included, and that funding should ensure that differences are created, different tools are created rather, depending upon level of need, meaning direct grants versus financing options, depending upon income level in particular.
Thanks, Liz. And just to note, that is the level of detail around funding and financing that I think we are signaling across the board on these recommendations. Is we are not looking for December 1 clarity exactly on funding and amounts and sources and all the like. However, the kind of guidance that Liz just described is a great thing to add if it's available. Any other thoughts about this issue on the funding of this particular recommendation? Okay, great. There's a series of things here that are labeled as public comments throughout. And I don't know how long this list is. I'm just scrolling down myself. Not very long. Okay. I don't know if there's some things here, Liz, you want to group up maybe and speak to. I think also, I think here, I'm just looking quickly. Yeah, the first one is related to a counselor comment as well about impacts of large hydropower and the real greenhouse gas reductions from large hydropower such as Hydro-Quebec. So I'll leave it in your
and that's
hands.
come up. And that's come up in other subcommittee reports here and there as well. Yeah, both that one as well as the last one on the list, concerns regarding chemicals, came up both through counselor comments and public comments. So we felt like grouping them and making sure it was noted that we had received them more than one way would be important rather than just on a single date from a single person. On the first one, level of greenhouse gas emissions from certain renewable resources, including biomass and HQ. I think those are the two specific ones that have come up, although many have pointed out that depending upon the level of review that's done, it would apply to all sources as it would apply to fossil fuel sources, of course. The text does note that the Science and Data Subcommittee recommended further work on the greenhouse gas inventory methodology, as well as some supplemental work to the methodology that's presently in place. And I think Ed and I agree that that's the place for this to live, and that is noted in text. So I'm not sure if the subcommittee wants to talk about putting further text in the electric sector mitigation section, or if instead our notation that it lives in the recommendations of the other subcommittee is adequate. So that would be the discussion we should be having here. We did note it in the text and agree that that's the important work that's happening. I think we've adopted that work.
Right. And if I can also just add that this is in part stemming from the recommendation of looking at 100% renewable or carbon-free portfolio standard. And that is not, we have not proposed a very specific, X amount of solar, X amount of wind, regional versus. Instead, we've recommended that PUC, or it could be some other entity if the council chooses, actually design or look at designing the different options, look at the trade-offs among the different options. And embedded within that is, as Liz said, some of the GHG inventory studies that Science and Data have recommended, and EFG in particular have recommended to enhance the GHG inventory around the electric sector. So this is all, to me, this is all sort of combined. This is a study that we need to look at. A lot of this needs further study. There's nothing in our recommendations now that say we're going to pull the trigger on something immediately. Legislation, we have legislation in the back pocket. None of that is accurate. Simply go out, look at this, study all the ramifications. It's really important. You're setting forward requirements for a portfolio that's going to be decades in the making, and hundreds of millions of dollars that Vermonters are going to pay, and take the time and study it well.
Great. Okay, that's helpful, Ed and Liz. Anything else on this issue of the greenhouse gas impact of these different sources and how the document refers to that? Okay. Do you want to grab a few others of these, Liz?
Sure.
Maybe the chemicals
Yeah.
ones, something like that.
Well, I think we can probably just go to the next one because it's somewhat, it's related to the extent that it's about the impact of energy choices. So we received specific comments throughout, and I think we've also seen this come up in other subcommittees, looking at impacts that are broader than stack emissions from different energy sources, and in particular Hydro-Quebec, and concerns regarding both the flooding of forest lands required for large reservoir hydro, as well as the land that the built environment sits on, being indigenous land that is, essentially used for a different purpose. And that can be both displacement of communities as well as flooding of artifacts and resources. So the recommendation here on the first goes back to the Science Data Subcommittee recommendations on GHGs we just talked about. So I think that's covered to the extent that the flooded forest land and the emissions that result for a period of time from that are a part of that concern. And then second, the concerns regarding both border trade-offs inside and outside of Vermont, as well as the trade-offs of energy choices generally, probably should be, and I think are being lifted up into a cross-cutting issue, since the same would be said of, certainly the fossil fuel usage that has been going on for decades and causing significant harm to specific communities, as well as carbon pollution that all of us are dealing with, needs to fit into that, along with the specific concerns on resources that have been addressed, like Hydro-Quebec.
Okay. So similar to what we just spoke about on the equity issue being more cross-cutting, this sort of broader question about trade-offs being more cross-cutting, any reactions to that? I don't know if anybody involved in the cross-cutting conversation actually is looking at that with that kind of frame. Maybe Jane can help. No, I see a sort of shaking head.
I would just say we're not looking at it with that kind of a frame. So just as a comment.
Okay. So it doesn't feel to fit neatly within the subcommittee. It feels more like a bigger conversation about how do we weigh different trade-offs. The cross-cutting group is not actually looking at that right now. So as a council, you can name that and say, this is for further discussion. I'm not quite sure how people want to react to that right now. Abby?
Oh.
I mean, I think it's going to be, again, as I understand it, it's about transparency. Obviously, there are no choices that we can make that don't have impact somewhere, whether it's here or somewhere else. It's more just a matter of being very transparent about both the process by which we came to assess those trade-offs and ramifications, and then also the transparent about the decisions that we're making as to where and when we make the choices to go in a certain direction or not, so that, you know, the public feels like they understand at least how we got to where we went.
Right.
I'm
the decision
wondering,
made.
yeah, I'm wondering, Abby, if you have a reaction. This is one where, given that the recommendation that it most closely refers to is the 100% res, which could include, by the way, changes to res even as it now is, since that's been raised as a concern. Maybe ensuring that the language around trade-off in energy choices, and specifically concerns that have been raised on the biomass and HQ, for example, get addressed in the framing of any changes to the res. That might be a way to acknowledge that it needs to happen. It hasn't been addressed in the report, and isn't being, you know, nothing about our recommendations is changing the status quo right now, and those would have to be looked at in the event the status quo were to change. I don't know if you have a reaction to whether that would at least get toward the transparency that you're suggesting, and, you know, I agree with.
I think it could. I'll have to reread it sort of with that frame in mind. Maybe you and I can talk at a certain point to figure out. But yes, I think certainly there's an option there.
Okay. Yeah, we can look at the when this gets posted, which will either be later today or tomorrow, is my guess. We can look at changes and see whether those are getting toward this issue, and, you know, discuss it next time we're on this subject as a council, and happy to follow up separately, of course.
Thanks.
Okay, anything else on that one?
Looks good.
Should I keep going?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay, you know, we might want to actually hit a couple down on chemicals, because it's most closely grouped with these in terms of how we would suggest it get handled. Because it too is, this was a concern we received in various ways through public comments and public forum. It came up in public in-person meetings, and at least one counselor raised it specifically with regard to, I think, batteries, if I remember correctly, but it's come up with regard to solar panels and other things as well. So we put in the comment more generally to acknowledge we'd received that. And our suggestion is, again, this one is similar to what we just talked about. It's a matter of acknowledging and describing the trade-offs for all choices, including those that are driven by electrification, which will utilize less fossil fuel within Vermont, but have production impacts and potentially decommissioning life cycle impacts, such as the chemicals and batteries.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Abby.
And maybe Liz and I should just talk. But one of my questions about chemicals was sort of more a broad sense. I know in ag, we talk about chemicals, and that's something that comes up a lot. And I know that in the law, it was framed, you know, limit the use of chemicals and things like that. So it's my understanding with, you know, that pesticides are sprayed for the maintenance of certain lines and things like that. So I think it's more just maybe as like a state, wondering if there's sort of a way to frame. I think sometimes, just to be perfectly frank, the ag sector feels a little bit like there's a target on their back in this regard. And so I didn't know if this was maybe a moment where we could consider that more broadly as a state, you know, again, for transparency's sake, you know, this is where we're using chemicals, this is why we're using them, and sort of set up a new type of transparency around that issue as well, because it's certainly not just in agriculture that pesticides are used. And I think it's just helpful to more broadly inform that conversation and just get people on the same page.
Okay, I apologize. I didn't receive or understand that part of the comment. I thought it was limited to uses of, items, you know, electrification items and renewable energy. For electric mitigation in terms of reducing carbon pollution, we did not address that issue. And there are best management practices, and the ag rule on pesticides applies to any provider of pesticides or applier, including the utilities. for sure. So I don't know if that's something that would fit in this text, or I don't know what the solution there is, given that it's, I think you're right, broader than carbon reduction.
Well, little known
Broader
fact,
than what we looked at.
pesticides are a byproduct of fossil fuels. So I think that's something to consider in it as well. If we're wanting to reduce fossil fuel usage, that's another component of some of those things. I'm not sure where it fits either. It might be that it needs to be a cross-cutting thing because it's a called out component of the law. I don't know.
Abby, can I just ask a follow-up? Where are you talking specifically about use of chemicals in managing transmission line corridors? Or are you thinking bigger than that, like some other application?
No, I'm thinking about that primarily, and just I've brought this up a number of times in a number of different forums. It's just never seemed to get discussed at any point. There's a lot of chemical usage in the state. And it's specific, we keep referencing all these things that are specifically called out in the law. This is one of them. And I feel like it just hasn't really been something that we've talked about that much. Maybe it's just not something we're going to talk about, but pesticides have they need to be used as, they're a tool in the toolbox, but they need to be treated thoughtfully. And we need to be assessing, where they're going to become used more. If, for example, there are ramifications to grid increase or, again, this is not my area of expertise. That's why I'm asking the question.
It's not mine either specifically, but I do know that, for example, undergrounding techniques, which is something that we and other utilities are looking at, help address overall usage, as well as just making choices over time to maintain rights of way differently. We have worked with ANR and with AG on those issues, I know, at GMP over the years, and I know other utilities have faced it too. So yeah, I'm not sure where it fits specifically, because it's definitely beyond the expertise that we brought to this carbon reduction portion of the cross-sector work. So it might be something that, and we can add to the table. If the table is going to be used in the report, I can certainly make sure that the table comment is clear, so that this was among the other issues raised. That would be some help, because at least we'd capture it correctly that way. I don't know if others have thoughts on how to handle it, but
it's fine. I see Jane is saying that I'm misinterpreting the law. That seems to be, I guess, just my lot in life. So whatever.
Hang on.
I can chime in on this a little bit.
Sure, Rich, go ahead.
Liz and Abby, there are existing provisions regarding the use of herbicides for right-of-way maintenance, including public notice to landowners and utility customers generally, and the opportunity for landowners to object to the use of herbicides on their property. There's a pretty well-developed regime for managing those uses. So if I'm not aware that there's a big problem with that regime. There may be objections to it, but I'm quite familiar with it in the past. Utilities are regulated with respect to the use of herbicides for right-of-way maintenance. So
I understand that. I think what I'm trying to get at is maybe the law has missed some things. And I think that I understand the timeline, but I'm also I keep being told, here's where we're closely adhering to the law, and here's where we're going to give over interpretation of it. And pesticides and herbicides are byproducts of fossil fuels. So either we care about reducing fossil fuels or we don't. And whether the law says that or not, you can't be claiming this narrow interpretation when it applies to something that the broader majority of us think is important versus the lesser majority of us who have opinions in different ways or think about things in a different way. I mean, the questions about food security yesterday just illustrated to me, I mean, the reason food security matters is it's an enormous greenhouse gas emitter globally. And I just fundamentally believe in think globally and act locally. And that means that you assess these things holistically where you are. So I understand that this doesn't apply specifically, but it still matters.
Great. I see some more hands. June?
If I could just follow up with Abby for a moment. Abby, it sounds to me like what you're raising is a question about what is the entry point. If I haven't lost you, Abby, because you've gone off camera, what is the entry point for this conversation? Because I can say this, in listening to your comments, I am newly educated to the point that these pesticides are a function of fossil fuel extraction, as I think you're saying. They're byproducts has been your phrase. And I have to say, I find your argument compelling. And I don't know where to find that point of entry for how we deal with something like that. Do you have a suggestion, or is where you are at this point that you despair of our understanding that this is a thing? And I shouldn't say our, because I can't speak for the other 21 counselors, but you've persuaded me that it's a thing. Is that what you're expressing?
I just think that there is so much in the agricultural sector that we solely tend to bear the brunt of. Pesticides and herbicides are one of those things, because the understanding of sort of the breadth of their usage in other applications in many different, right? Tourism, ski, golf courses, there's so many uses of them. And so it's another one of those places where it's hard for me to bring it up, to be totally honest. I am an organic farmer. I obviously do not believe personally in the usage of those chemicals. I also understand them to be, at this moment in time, because of the systems in which farmers have been placed, that they're a necessary component of a toolbox. And I assume that it's the same for the electric sector, et cetera, right? I am not saying at this moment they should be outlawed, but they are a component of the fossil fuel industry. And I don't understand why we wouldn't be trying to think more holistically about how we can in any way reduce our reliance on those systems, if that is in fact the goal of what we're trying to do as a state. It isn't just emissions really matter, they must be reduced, but this is a whole systems thing. And so, that's my point here, is just that, it needs to be considered in a more broad way where those impacts are happening, and all the different ways. Maybe it's an education thing,
Okay. Let me mirror back to you a little bit what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is you standing on the outside of this particular presentation, which has more narrowly to do with the electricity sector for a moment. And what you're hearing the discourse say about the use of pesticides leads you to a more 10,000 foot point of view, where you're saying, hey folks, where are we going to consider the implications of continuing to be reliant on pesticides, which are a byproduct of fossil fuel? Our objective here is to stop using stuff like that in order to get greenhouse gases down. And we don't seem to be having a serious conversation about that. And I think that the way I would approach that is to say, when folks here are saying that here is how we address the use of pesticides in this particular slice of the pie, what they are telling us is the issue of responsible use of pesticides is given consideration, and there are regulations and laws about it. Here's where we are today. They are not saying that the issue doesn't matter. In fact, I'm going to guess that some people are like me, learning about it from your point of view for the first time. And my own reaction is, you've got a point. And in this report, we need some place to enter into those issues. And I'll share with you that I'm not entirely confident where that entry point is in our report right now. But I do think I hear you, that it needs to be addressed. I hope you can hear me if I say that in terms of this narrower part of our mandate, it is being addressed within the existing framework. And perhaps the point that you're making is that framework itself needs to be questioned and altered. And we need a place in this report to say that. I hope that's been helpful to you. I just don't want to lose you on the strength of frustration because I know how that feels.
Thanks, June. That's helpful.
Fantastic. Ed?
Yeah, I just wanted to note process-wise, it might actually make sense to have this embedded within science and data. My memory is that this is not, the GHG inventory does not capture herbicides, pesticides, and it might make sense to actually start with a reporting of, and I'm sure that we can get this from Agency of Ag and other folks as well. How much is actually used? How is it used? Who are the licensed pesticide applicators? And get a better handle on the actual use of it first, because this is more of a science-driven effort, or at least getting the underlying data as to how much is actually used, who's using it. And then the next step is figuring out what are the best ways to actually reduce given that data. So I'd make a suggestion that it be framed within cross-cutting and science and data recommendation.
Thanks, Ed. It's really helpful. Joey?
I agree that it's a very big issue. I'm glad we're lifting it. And whether we go with Ed's recommendation, which could be very helpful because it's much bigger, more surgically, there may be an opportunity. And I wonder if Ed, Liz, cross-sector could consider a recommendation around minimizing the use of herbicides, like in transition distribution, renewable facility deployment. I mean, it seems like that would be one small place to start, and as we explore a greater exploration of the issue.
Thanks, Joey.
Yeah, my only concern there would be getting back to Rich's point. There is a really comprehensive, it's run through Agency of Agriculture, actually, which, Abby's right to point out, it doesn't just apply to farms. And ANR has, over the years, also weighed in. So, yeah, I know that it exists and on a yearly basis. We and other utilities, and I'm sure other industries that have reason to maintain corridors or areas of land have to follow those. So I hesitate to put in a specific recommendation without having experts study it further. So I support what Ed suggested, which is we lift it up as cross-cutting and make sure that it gets addressed more comprehensively.
Okay. Thanks, Liz. Chris Campany?
Maybe a discrete action that could be added is, and Erica, I think if you're on here, I'm gonna just heads up, I'm about to tap you on the shoulder. There are what are called Tier 2 reporting facilities under the Community Right to Know Act. They're supposed to report everything that they've got that are hazardous materials. And I'm not sure how accessible that list is, but I put in the chat the typical chemicals that need to be reported. And it's like ranging from diesel fuel, gasoline, propane, kerosene, aviation fuel, argon, acetylene, nitrogen, ammonia, antifreeze, hydraulic oils, transformer oils, explosives. I mean, so much of this stuff comes out, pesticides, fertilizers. So much of this stuff comes out of, the petroleum and natural gas cracking process. And, maybe we've got that list. It may be a simple action could be examine the Tier 2 reporting lists for chemicals derived from greenhouse gas emitting processes to determine the impacts collectively among, Vermont users and what, so that at least that way we'd have a baseline. Because I know we keep talking about pesticides, but it's more than just pesticides. It's a lot of stuff that we use. And having lived in Louisiana for 7 years and seen where a lot of this stuff is manufactured, and that being the cradle of a lot of America's environmental justice and equity concerns, we do need to elevate this. This is one of those things that kind of beyond border issues that we need to take into effect. Yes, probably Vermont's consumption of those materials nationwide is pretty darn small, but it still has an effect. And so, to Abby's point.
Thanks, Chris. So that's a specific idea on how to get more data and do the right kind of study. June, is that a new hand or an old hand?
No, sorry.
Okay, great. All right. So this is an issue that sounds like it's not quite yet reflected in the table, and Liz offered to update the table to reflect it. There's some specific requests about, could we send this to science and data explicitly as a pathway? Joey asked if could we actually make a recommendation about limiting herbicide use, and Liz had some words of caution about that because we haven't actually studied the existing protocol and approach. So that requires some study. That's what I've captured here in my notes. Is there anything else to name this issue? And June eloquently spoke to the fact that we're lifting up an issue that doesn't have an obvious entry point into our work. And so that's why it feels a little bit frustrating about how we land this thing in a way that feels like it addresses the underlying core concerns around it. Anything else on this issue? Okay, great. Liz, are there other pieces we want to address from this list? And I just realized I've been sharing my screen the whole time, and please tell me to just drop my screen if we want to see each other better.
Why don't we just name the last two and then you can drop your screen. They're both related in terms of how we handled them in the report and in the suggested edits that will get posted. And they were comments that we received throughout. One was generally on the need for what's usually termed additionality in our renewable energy standard. The non-technical way of saying that is ensuring that Vermont's renewable energy standard encourages new renewables, not simply renewables as presently drafted. It's a 75% requirement for renewables, and there's a 10% carve out for locally sited small new renewables, but otherwise the current res does not specify. And that has the effect of, from a cost point of view, encouraging the rest of the res to be existing because of the way the rec market and energy markets work. So the comment about if res is going to be revisited and expanded or changed in any way, that it focus on additionality was one that we received. And it's one that broadly, I think there's agreement on. And we've attempted to address it in text by recommending that when Vermont changes the res, ideally to adopt 100% framework, that among the design options considered is a greater level of new renewable resources, both in state, which presently is defined as small scale, but also regionally, which could be any resource, any size renewable, to make sure that we're helping not just Vermont, but the region as a whole, and therefore eventually the country and the world, to create additional new renewables that will fully displace in the future fossil fuels.
Great.
Similarly, and let me just say the last one, and then we can maybe drop screen. The last one was on siting concerns, and it's phrased that way in the comment column specifically because we received various concerns. Some were concerned about land use issues that I think we spoke about to some extent yesterday in addressing the land use sections from that subcommittee's report. And then others had actually somewhat of a opposite concern that in-state renewables be more strongly encouraged and placed within Vermont in order to meet various goals we have, including economic and others. So as it says here in the comment, that one also in the 100% res framework is among the questions that were listed and things that need to be taken into consideration in choosing whether to revisit the res, and if so, how much in-state renewable, whether siting location, including transmission constraints and other things, are a part of that design. But the main goal of the 100% res being to ensure that we have low or no carbon resources available to power Vermont as we switch away from fossil fuels. So I think we could probably stop sharing the screen and then take comments on those.
Great. Okay. Any thoughts on those from the council about the way the subcommittee is responding to those comments? Additional changes that might need to happen? Okay. Great. All right. Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for that, particularly Liz and Ed for walking us through that section. It sounds like we were able to lift up and address several of those concerns. And there's some adjustments to the table that we've noted as we've gone along in the conversation. All right, so I don't have anything else for us to work with right now. Bram, you have your hand up. Go ahead, please.
I just want to respond to what Abby said and what Iris put in the comments, and related to the broader discussion of pesticide use and environmental justice. I think John Muir, said something like, "Pull on anything in this world and you will rapidly find it is connected to everything else." And I think we can draw a pretty short line between global warming and greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of other really important things. I can off the top of my head draw a pretty short line between prison reform and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that it's important that we find a way to acknowledge that in our work. Clearly it's beyond the scope. And if we tried to address prison reform, for instance, it would take away from our ability to finish the focused work that we have to do on greenhouse gas emissions. But I do think it's important that we find a way to recognize what we do. And, I don't know if it's an appendix to the climate action plan that calls out these are issues related to our work and important to advancing environmental justice and social justice. And, we acknowledge that and understand that and did not address them or something. But I do think, pesticide use and, all the other issues that we have raised that are connected closely, but perhaps not internal to what we're doing are important not to lose sight of all those things.
Thanks, Bram. Yeah. And I've heard the word transparency a lot today, of just saying clearly we understand these are issues. We don't have solutions yet to these issues, and we want to acknowledge them. Joey?
Well, appreciate that sentiment. So I was going to pivot and say, looking forward to next week's conversation on a lot more, including the transportation work. And if folks have time or interest, I know people are fairly maxed out, but people may recall that at the Energy Action Network Summit, one of the pitches that was put forward by Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility and Capstone was imagining what Vermont might do with transportation and climate initiative revenue. And EAN BBSR are hosting conversation to on Friday at noon in a webinar. I'll drop it in the chat, really to focus in on some of the programs that are underway or could potentially be expanded or undertaken with potential TCI revenues, and relevant because, as you well know, it's one of the recommendations that the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee has put forward. So just inviting people, if you're not already way too overwhelmed, to join if you can. I think it probably will be recorded as well. So noon on Friday.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks for the heads up on that. June?
Yeah, I'm sorry to pivot back, Joey. Don't mean to be rude. I just want to go back to what Bram had said a moment ago, because I think what I got out of his comment was a perfect illustration of how this plan also needs to be iterative in nature. And I hope that we find some way to note in our report that, among other things, our learning and understanding has grown as we have struggled mightily with all of the information and the issues we've taken up. And perhaps, again, I don't want to assign my ignorance to everybody else on the council, but perhaps this issue about pesticides is one of those issues where it's not just that we acknowledge the issue, Bram, but that we acknowledge the need to develop a more granular understanding of the concerns that people like Abby are raising for us to consider, and that we contemplate that will be part of the continuous or a refinement or the iterative process in shaping and reshaping this plan. I think people like Abby need to have comfort that this isn't a train that's leaving the station for good. And I'm not sure we've touched on that theme yet.
Thanks, June. And indeed, the iterative nature is something that I think I've heard many counselors say is critical for us being able to actually do something on December 1. Because if not, there is no way that you as a counselor are going to feel comfortable giving a sign off on anything on December 1 if folks don't feel comfortable that there will be iteration and improvement and upgrades and updates. Okay. Anything else before we do a little public comment here? Great. Okay, so if you are observing our meeting today and you'd like to offer some public comment, particularly on the issues that we've been wrestling with today, now's a great time. Let's see how many folks, and then I'll ask folks to be to limit their comments to just a couple minutes, so that everybody gets a chance and we respect the overall time. I see 2 hands up. So Matt Voss, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for continuing the work. And thank you, Jane, for laying out that public engagement process at the beginning. It was really helpful to hear that, especially given the large amount of concern coming out of the Just Transition subcommittee and everywhere. I would just raise the chat comment from Lauren Oates at that time, just before she had to leave, about how Climate Access could propose a process for how we actually incorporate the robust public feedback into the next iteration of the CAP. I think, as I can only assume, the Climate Council is going to be meeting often still post December 1. It's really interesting and important to really, for the public to hear how that feedback and engagement could change things. So yeah, I would just raise that comment again and look forward to hearing more about it.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Stephen Crawley.
Hi, thank you. And thanks everybody for all the work you're doing. Interesting discussion today. And it's great to see you taking on the task of being responsive to comments both internally and from outside. So I appreciate that very much. I was going to make 2 comments, but Matt really covered the first one. I'll just add to what he said. Yeah, I think that it's really important to figure out how to really robustly incorporate that, let people know and feel that they are being heard and that their voices really matter. I don't see that as I look through the memo that was on the agenda today regarding the March to or December to March engagement process. I don't see that component in there. But I'll just leave it at that. Matt said it really well. The other comment that I would make is in regard to the electricity proposals and feedback there. What I heard was that a lot of the ideas that were raised through comments are expected to be addressed through or within the context of looking at 100% res. And and that might work out okay. That's possible, but there are a couple of pretty big flaws with that might be excluded very easily. Well, for one, just the idea of a renewable standard is kind of a binary concept. It's renewable or it's not. And greenhouse gases aren't like that. What we know is that so many of these things that might be considered renewable, biomass, hydro of various sizes, especially the big ones, these are not greenhouse gas free, which is what we assume when we call those things renewable. So there's a big question about whether it's possible to get it right in a renewable standard. Maybe it has to be a greenhouse gas reduction standard or something like that. It's complicated, as you all know. The other fundamental flaw that exists with the current system, it has to do with the renewable energy credits, these especially the unbundled environmental attributes that get bought and sold. And in some cases, those work well and are really appropriate. But in other cases, they don't work well. And just, an example is when there are many times, maybe right now, when the purchase of RECs is used to call some portion of our power portfolio renewable, when in fact it's actually being powered by natural gas imported from other states and producing greenhouse gas emissions, even while we call it renewable. So that there's a fundamental flaw in there someplace, and it's complicated. It needs to be addressed, and I'm not sure it can within the context of 100% renewable, something we call 100% res. But that's maybe part of the discussion that's expected. I hope it is. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I appreciate those comments. I see one more hand from Zach.
So your upgrade is.
And I see
Thanks, David.
just Brian Gray, if you don't mind muting your line, that would be helpful.
David, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Zach, go ahead, please.
Okay, great. I'm in a car, so I just wanted to make sure that you can get my audio. Yeah, thanks for the chance to comment again. This is Zach Porter. I spoke with you last night briefly from Standing Trees. And I want to thank Steve Crowley for his comments just now. I also really want to call out Abby for raising some just critically important points on the fossil fuel and of course many other related detrimental impacts of heavy fertilizer and pesticide and herbicide use. And so really glad that that's entering into the conversation as well. And I did want to register one thing that I meant to say last night that I did not, which is my disappointment that Judy Dow was not a part of the conversation about biomass yesterday, because I doubt there's been another person who has taken that issue as seriously and really, made sure that she investigated the science and then reported back to you all what she had discovered, and has really advocated very effectively on some of the points that Steve was just making, that if our focus is on renewables, we're missing the point. We need to focus on low carbon and burning trees, and to kind of push back on something that was said last night. We're burning whole trees at McNeil and Rygate, whole trees, not waste product, or at least not just waste product. We're burning a lot of whole trees that you can easily see in the log yards of these facilities. And this is absolutely not low carbon. Burning biomass emits 1.5 times the carbon of burning coal for an equivalent amount of electricity produced. And we don't get to see that carbon accumulated again for decades, if not a century, if ever. So we are really kicking the can down the road and letting our kids and our grandkids deal with the problem that we have an opportunity to address today if we continue to kind of have a focus just on this quote unquote on renewables and aren't really focusing on low carbon energy. So I just wanted to register again that I was just extremely disappointed that Judy Dow wasn't a part of that conversation yesterday. I wish that the agenda could have been designed to make sure that she had been. And I hope that you'll take her concerns that she raised in what she wrote up as a biomass case statement, which I shared with you all earlier today. I hope that you'll look through that carefully. It contains a lot of excellent references and easy to access links to more information about biomass. And if you would like to have a conversation with me, I welcome the chance, but appreciate your continued investigation of the real impacts of biomass. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing additional hands for public comment today. I'll just give it a moment here.
David, can I just say that in response to Zach and Stephen, we do have or carbon and the potential change to a carbon standard in the text. I'm sorry that we didn't talk about it today. I think Ed will probably agree with me that we received that comment enough that we can add that to the table so that it's both called out in the text as well as recognized as a consistent public comment. They're right that that's been raised before, and we do have it reflected in the text as something that needs to be addressed thoughtfully.
That's great.
Including a potential change in the standard to go to carbon instead.
Okay. Annette, I just saw your hand go up. If you can just do a quick comment, and then we'll need to finish up our meeting today.
Thank you. I haven't heard all of your meeting today, but I wanted to comment about pesticides, and in particular, the state of Vermont is using massive quantities of pesticides. I'm shocked by the numbers. And so one of the things to look at in the electricity sector is the use of pesticides along all the power lines in Vermont. And tangential to the discussion about the other things that go into renewables, I hope that the report will reflect concerns about the sourcing of solar panels, slave labor being used, and all that goes with that, the silicon production. I mean, we're heading down a path that is going to require a whole lot more mining. And if that's not referenced in the report, I think that's that does a disservice to the planet. So thank you.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate that comment. All right, folks. I think that's the end of the road for us today. We've gone a little bit over. Thanks for everybody engaging in this conversation. As Jane said yesterday, and I believe again today, there will be documents posted today, if they're not already up, for next week's meeting. There are a variety of documents. They're not up yet? No. There will be posted documents for next week's meeting and an email going out to review them. And we are scheduling for next week's meetings, both on on Tuesday and then the following day, time to pick up the issues that we didn't get to pick up with cross-sector, particularly transportation, but also other elements of the cross-sector recommendations we didn't get to last week because of our heavy focus on the buildings piece. So stay tuned for that. We are in this home stretch here of the next few weeks of a lot of material to review, and we are incredibly grateful for people making time in their lives to do this. It is a big, heavy lift, and everybody gets it. So we'll see you next week, and thanks everybody for being so engaged on this. Take care. Have a great rest of your day. All the best.